Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into sexuality in men versus women.
I like the versus part. Men versus women. It sounds like a contest. How about men compared to women?
Men compared to women. Okay, sure. That works better. Sexuality should not be a competition.
Well, no.
I agree. I can agree with that. So the differences in sexuality in men and women. So
Yes,
we're going to start with a couple of disclaimers. One being that anytime that Dr. Burton and I talk about sexuality or anything surrounding sexuality, we are professional. We use proper clinical terms. We are anatomically correct. So you don't have to worry about vulgarity from us. And then
I can be vulgar pretty often, but I won't be tonight. Okay. I promise.
I appreciate
That's a part of me that Liz doesn't know. So
okay. Well,
but thank you for saying that.
We'll keep the podcast professional.
Yes. There we go.
So the other disclaimer is that we're going to be making a lot of generalizations.
Yeah.
And the thing about generalizations is they are generally true, but not always. So when we talk about the generality of sexuality in men and the generality of sexuality in women, it can be the opposite, right? Or it cannot apply to you or someone else.
Yeah, and so I really appreciate when you do this about the generalization, because I often forget to do that. And you're absolutely right that, it applies to many, many people. It doesn't apply to everyone. So that's important for our
Yes, important to understand. Okay, so to start off with, I realized this bizarre concept when I was taking a class on marital dynamics for school, and sexuality is important in marriage and any relationship. This topic came up. We did an entire section on this. And it occurred to me that talking about sex is more vulnerable than actually having sex, which seems so backwards. What could be more vulnerable than being naked in front of somebody?
Naked with each other? Yeah.
Yes. Talking about it is a lot more vulnerable.
That is really interesting. So here's my experience, and you'll find this, one day you're going to be a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And most couples, there's a generalization, most couples are really open about talking about sexuality with the therapist in that room. But when you ask them, do you talk about it with each other at home? Mm-hmm. Then the answer is generally no.
Yeah.
And so that vulnerability, so for some reason, they feel less vulnerable. I don't know what that is. I've never thought about it, actually, until right now that you're bringing it up. But it appears to me that they feel less vulnerable talking about it with therapists. And maybe it's because they figure there's, possibly an expert or someone who's worked with other couples. Because I would guess at least 80% of the couples that I see, we end up at some point talking about sexuality. So for me, I think for therapists, you can convey that you're very comfortable talking about it, which I do. I mean, I don't. Mm-hmm. I generally don't ask about it in the first session.
Yeah.
But certainly by the second session or third session, I ask them how it's going. And sometimes, depending on the connection, I will ask about it in the first session. But you're right. The thing with the difference between talking about it and actually doing it, that's a really good question. What are your ideas on that? Why would that be so?
Man, I don't know.
Have you ever thought about that?
My guess is that because, we do it so often, right? Or at least many couples do. And thinking back to the first couple of times, right? Like the first couple of times you're intimate with someone, that is pretty vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Because it's, that is new. But then maybe it just becomes so routine and so normal that it's like, okay, we've done this so many times, it's just normal, but we don't talk about it as much. And
so here's my idea after just for a few minutes of pondering this, is that I think that when you talk about sex, it's generally about what do you like or what you don't like.
Mm-hmm.
So couples again, from my experience, can generally talk about easily how often they have sex. But
Yeah.
if one of them is unhappy or not satisfied or wants something different, then I think that's very vulnerable because you're talking about something incredibly intimate that you would never share with anyone else. And so to
Yeah.
put that out there, even to say, well, I would like it if you do this or if you
Hmm.
did this, is risky, I think, for some people.
Maybe.
And I think the reason is the possibility of feeling judged
Or rejected. I think
or
fear of
rejected. You judged or rejected, absolutely. So
yeah.
I think it's that. I think that because most of the time when they're talking about it, they're talking about something very personal to them.
Hmm. Yeah, and that makes sense to me, and I've thought about this, and I thought about this just for myself, right? I mean, between me and Curtis, and we have communication is something that we do very, very well. But, I can understand where this is coming from because I'm like, yeah, it is easier than talking
Hmm.
about it. And, it takes time for me and I really process and I really think through what I'm going to say. And honestly, I think that's probably a good thing because if you are going to have a conversation about sexuality in marriage, and if it involves your partner in some way, and maybe
Hmm.
something that they are doing that you'd like them to do differently, I think you do want to be very careful with that, in that
Hmm.
you don't want to harm, even
Right.
unintentionally, you don't want to be hurtful in any way.
Right.
And so, you need to be able to talk about important things like
Hmm.
in terms of sexuality. But I think it is good to ponder it, take that time, and to really think through how you're going to say it so that you don't unintentionally hurt your partner, because that can be damaging and it can be hard to recover
Right.
from that.
Right. Because once you hear something, you can't unhear it. I think we live in a culture that's fairly judgmental about
Yeah.
sexuality. And so we all grow up that way. And, often if you grow up in a religious tradition that is somewhat judgmental, then in your mind, you've been, brought up to really be careful about what you say about it. So there's that. This is an aside that I'm going to say.
Hmm.
So there's one thing so couples will freely talk about sex. There's one thing that is really hard for couples to talk about. What do you think that is?
I don't
It's
know.
not sex. It's how much money they make,
Oh, yeah.
which has
Yeah, you told me
always
that
blown me
before.
away.
Yeah.
You can and Gottman thinks it's something that's really important to talk about, but boy, do people hate to talk about that.
Yeah.
How much money are we talking about here? And they just clam up.
Huh.
Anyway, but they'll freely talk about what they do in the bedroom. So
That is,
anyway,
yeah, that is interesting. I don't know. Vulnerability, it's weird. It's
yeah.
just,
Well, it's about being judged. So if you
yeah.
think about it, if I tell you, well, I make this much money, my thought is, well, they're going to judge me in some way. It's all
Hmm.
about it. The vulnerability is about the potential for judgment.
Yeah, I think so because we have such a strong and innate desire
Yep.
to be accepted by
Yep.
our peers, and especially somebody if, who are seeking help from. I
Mhm.
mean, we especially want, I mean, you want your therapist to like you. You want to connect with them. That's you're
Right.
there to
Yeah.
seek help and it's someone that you respect. So hopefully, anyways. Okay, so let's talk about why sexuality matters so much in a relationship. My perspective is because we are innately sexual beings and we
I
have,
agree. Yeah.
okay, yeah, I mean, we have desires and, these urges that we need to satisfy.
Hmm.
And so
Yep.
it matters in a relationship.
Well, there's that. So there's the let's call it just the physical piece.
Hmm.
But then I think in long-term relationships, there's the emotional piece, the connection
Yeah.
piece. Now, at first, in previous podcasts, we've talked about, how at the start of any relationship, the hormones are different, everything's different, and so the intensity or the passion around sexuality is generally heightened around
Hmm.
the start of most relationships, and that lasts, 6 months to 2 years. But in long-term relationships, so both of us, you and I are both in long-term relationships, and that shifts over time. So I think anyway
Yeah.
that it becomes, I was going to say equally important, possibly more important, especially as we age. Like, I'm much older than you. The emotional piece
Hmm.
uh, really becomes more important once your body starts to fail you. But, it's the connection that you find. And now here's one of the differences between men and women that I think we've talked about. I don't know if we want to go into too much detail today, but that for women, they want to feel emotionally connected to their partner before they have sex. Again,
Yep.
generalization.
Mm-hmm.
For men, what happens is they generally feel emotionally connected after they've had sex. And so I think one of the reasons that I think often wives or female partners tend to misinterpret what's going on with a male partner who always wants sex.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're together, newly together, then yeah, there's a physical thing going on. But later on in the relationship, I think for a lot of men, it's the only way, maybe not the only way, it's the easiest way
That they know
for
how.
them to know how to get that connection that they want. Because I think this is universal with the couples that I see, and I hear sometimes, oh, he just wants to always have sex. And then if we get into it, I really want to be close to her.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things we try and do in therapy is to try and help the male learn different techniques to be closer.
Right.
So that it's like increasing their toolbox for being connected so that it doesn't always have to be sex. But I think it's important for our female listeners to understand that I really believe in long-term relationships that it shifts a lot to becoming more about emotional connection and feeling close.
Right. And it's also, I think, important for, both couples or both people in a heterosexual relationship to understand that difference,
Well, I think it's true in gay relationships too. I don't know that it's that different.
Okay, so but in a homosexual relationship, typically, like, you're not going to have you're going to have they're going to be feeling the same, right? If we're talking about the generalization.
I think that's a misconception that we have. So, my thesis, which I haven't talked about, not my thesis, my dissertation was on long-term gay male relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And what you find is that, we're just different. And,
right.
And so even if you put two men together, the assumption is that they're both going to want to have sex all the time. That's just not true. That's
okay, right. Accurate. Sure, but is it also going to be true that they both are going to desire sex because it's how they will feel best connected to their partner?
No. And so you can often find one who just really wants to be emotionally connected first.
Okay.
It feels there are many more similarities, at least in gay male relationships and heterosexual relations. I didn't look into lesbian relationships, so I really can't speak about that. But I certainly can with gay male relationships, and there are many more similarities than we realize. Because I think ultimately we're just human, and we want the same thing. We do want the sex, and we want the connection.
Yeah, right. And I think, so it's important for women to understand that, hey, my husband's trying to feel close to me, but it's also important for men to understand, what can I do to help her feel more emotionally connected so she is more receptive to me?
Exactly. We could end right now, because I think that's a big takeaway for me.
Yeah.
With
it is.
In heterosexual relationships is to understand the differences. So, what we're trying to do in this podcast is talk about those differences between men and women. And for me, at least, so this is from my work, where I've seen a lot of heterosexual couples dealing with this problem. That's it exactly, is that women believe their husbands just want sex.
Yeah.
And their husbands think that the women ought to be responsive just like they are. When really you have to meet somewhere in the middle, and the men have to do a better job at, fostering that emotional connection. Yeah. And the women can move closer to satisfying that emotional need. And you both meet somewhere in the middle, where you're both getting the connection and the physical needs met.
Yeah. And, I think that a lot of it has to do with the way our brain works. So we did this episode it was Mark Gunger's A Tale of Two Brains. We did this episode a while ago where we talked about just how, with women, everything is interconnected. It's like a bunch of wires crisscrossing, but men are more compartmentalized, right? When they're at work, they're in a work box. When they're with their wife, they're in the wife box,
Hmm.
right? Or they're, the spouse box. And when they're the kids, they're in the kids box. And so it's so compartmentalized that they don't like, when it's time for sex, they're in the sex box. Like that's where they're at.
Right.
Women don't have boxes.
Right.
And so, from a women's perspective, if she is feeling stressed and overwhelmed, if it's been a really hard day and she's still got a bunch of different things to think about, it's so hard for her to just put all that aside and just be intimate, right? And to be,
See, right. And in a bit, I think we're going to talk about a couple of models, of sexuality, and that
Mhm.
really fits in to more current thinking about couple sexuality. So you're absolutely right. I like to think of it as men being more linear and women being non-linear. But
yeah,
I mean, the way you described it is exactly the way it is. I think generally the way it is.
yeah, yeah. In general, right? I mean,
Right.
obviously, there are people who are going to cross lines, right? You
Right.
can have
Right. Right.
people in any category. But so let's talk about the arousal cycle.
If we include a little bit of history here, I
Okay.
mean, so Masters and Johnson back in so their book came out in 1966 called Human Sexual Response. I can't remember the name of this movie. There was a pretty good movie that depicted how they did their whole research. It's kind of fascinating. Anyway, so they came up with a four-stage physiological model. And they really thought this was the order of occurrence. Excitement, so you're being turned on, I guess would
Mm-hmm.
be the way that
Yeah.
we might say it. Excitement. Plateau is when you're getting really close to having orgasm. So it's increased. I mean, if you think about plateau, I don't know why they call it plateau, but
It,
excitement, you're
yeah.
going up, to the plateau. And so plateau is not orgasm.
Mm-hmm.
That's the next stage. So the third stage is orgasmic. And then the last stage is what they call resolution stage. It's just where you're shifting back. Your physiology is changing back to the way it was. Now they maintain that both men and women have that same
Mm-hmm.
cycle.
Yeah.
So that is, to be honest, and I did the graduate school with me for a long time ago, but I don't recall them talking about that at all.
Mm.
And so I think when we first started this podcast, the stage that or the model I was talking about, and sometimes I do still use this, is it was a woman named Helen Singer Kaplan. And she argued that they only evaluated that response from a physiological perspective, and that the psychological, emotional, and cognitive factors also need to be taken into account. And
Yes.
so she proposed this three-stage model, which I think must have been the one that I was taught many years ago. So the three phases: desire.
Mm-hmm.
Now she calls it excitement, but I would call it arousal. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we can use those terms interchangeably: desire, excitement, or arousal, and then the third stage being orgasm.
Mm-hmm.
When we've talked about sexuality before, I think that particular model, desire moving to arousal, moving to orgasm, works really well in those first, months or years of a relationship
Right.
when the female is highly sexualized as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because we were talking about the hormones, how they're different. But I think in long-term relationships, that doesn't work very well because in my mind, that model, desire, excitement, orgasm, is very much a male model. It
Yes.
works for men. High desire leads to arousal, then you want to have sex.
So, and I think that the original cycle, in terms of just, you plateau, you orgasm, then you go back down, that tracks true for both men and women. But that desire, that initial component is going to be so,
It's
so
different,
different.
right?
Yeah.
And so the resolution, it tends to track well for both men and women, although typically for women, they're able to have another orgasm much quicker than men.
Yeah.
And so the resolution, and that, again, that changes as you age. But,
Mm-hmm.
for men, the resolution to when you're ready to actually do that cycle again is much, much longer.
Yeah.
And so for a long time, the way I talked about sexuality with long-term couples was that you switch those first two, meaning you go for arousal or excitement first, which then leads to desire. See, I
Mm-hmm.
think, and then you move on to sex, and and I think this works for many couples because, as you mentioned, you've probably got kids, you've got stressful jobs,
Yeah.
the house is dirty, the dishes aren't done, and so if you're going to get to that place of high desire where you were 20 years ago, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to be waiting a very long time. And so
Yeah.
like if you make a choice, if you say, well, let's have sex, then really what you've done is you've shifted the first two and you work to arouse each other.
Mm-hmm.
And to all the couples I've talked to, and even in my own experience, if you shift that and you work on arousal, the desire comes.
Right.
Because often what you'll hear, at least in the therapy room, is that the desire doesn't come for as easily for women.
Mm-hmm.
But again, this is almost universal that, if if they let themselves be in that situation where they're both arousing each other, then the desire comes.
Right. And this is where the conversation is going to come in or we're talking about it is going to come in because you have to know and understand what that is for your partner, right? And
Yes.
so men, they need to be able to ask their wives or they need to be able to ask their partner, we sometimes it's been referred to as like the gas pedal and the brake pedal.
So that's the next model because I think
Yeah.
that's a separate model
Mm-hmm.
that I think is really important for us to talk about. So this this particular idea comes from the book "Come as You Are" by Emily Nagoski, and I think, I mean, again, I'm not going to say all sex therapists, but the sex therapists that I'm talking to, we had one who worked with us, Jordan, and this is a book that's highly recommended. I think it's written for women. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
target audience is women, but I always think it's really important for the male partners to read it. But so
Mm-hmm.
as you mentioned, this idea that she calls it a dual control model of
Yeah.
sexual response, and she calls it the gas pedal or the accelerator, and then the other part is the brake. And
Mm-hmm.
so the kind of easy way to understand that is the accelerator would be all the things that get you in the mood or turn you on, or
Mm-hmm.
that are leading to a sexual encounter. And then the brake pedals are the cleaning, the dishes, and the seeing
Right.
the toys all over the house. It's the things in your life that are saying don't go down that road, or mentally,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally, you aren't able to let go of these other things. And so one of the conversations that I think is helpful for a couple to have is to really think of it in those terms of, okay, what are your accelerators?
Yeah.
What are your brakes? And they're going to be different
Mm-hmm.
for each person, which is really important. And so this goes back to, you know, many podcasts. I think we've talked about the communication where your major goal is to listen and understand and have empathy and validation. And so even though the accelerators or the brakes for your partner might not make sense to you,
Yes.
you have to be able to say, I get it. You have to be able to listen well enough that that you'll be able to understand and say, I get it. It makes sense that you feel this way. That is really critical. So if we circle back to talking about why is it so hard to talk about sexuality, there's no judgment in that, right?
Right.
There's no judgment.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, I get it. So those
Yeah.
are I think that's the better model. Although I still like that second model, but I like the brake and accelerator model, the dual response.
Yeah. And knowing those and yes, it's important for men to understand this and for them to understand this about their wives. But hopefully, wives can also take an interest and want to know this for their husbands as well, because that can go a long way in helping men to feel more emotionally connected, or at least it can help men to feel desired by their wife. And I think that's important it can be hard for men to feel when their wife is just constantly saying, "Oh, no, not tonight," or, "I can't,
Yeah.
I can't, I can't." But if you actively take an interest, then feeling desired, that's going to feel good to him and that's going to help increase that emotional intimacy. So, don't neglect that fear in your husband. If he takes the chance or if he takes the opportunity or the time to say, "Hey, what are your gas and your brake?" Ask his too.
Yeah, this has to be a reciprocal process
Yeah,
because,
it does.
because if you see each other being vulnerable and really listening to each other, it can help. Just having that conversation can help you
Hmm.
feel more
Yeah,
connected and being able to really listen to the other person so the other person feels seen and heard around something that, pretty hard to talk about.
right.
But I really do like that model and so for our listeners, you can start thinking about what are your own accelerators,
Hmm.
what are your own gas pedals, and then also what are the brakes.
Yeah. And then have that conversation.
Right. Have the
So,
conversation.
so one thing I'm just gonna throw out there really quick. If you look at the book and you pull it up, the image on the book, it's a purse. I'm just gonna,
On for Come As You Are.
yes, it's a purse.
Okay.
It doesn't initially look like a purse. You pull it up and you're like, why,
What is
why is
that?
there, you're like, why do we need a
I
picture of
haven't.
a vagina on there? It's not, it's a purse. I'm
It's
just gonna
not.
tell you.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
I haven't. Okay.
it's a purse. Have you looked at it? I mean,
I.
and maybe
You
that's
know,
intentional.
I have. I just looked at it today, but I didn't notice anything about the cover.
Oh, okay.
Let me see.
I mean,
Okay.
it's probably intentional in that it's shaped, like the purse is maybe shaped and the colors are meant to look like a vagina. Maybe that's intentional, but it's a purse. Mark's looking it up now.
I'm looking it up because now I'm really curious.
Uh,
Well, I think
maybe it's just, I don't know, maybe it's just me.
I don't think it's meant to be a purse. I think it's meant to.
Oh, well, if you scroll in on it, it is definitely a purse. There's a zipper and everything, but
Right. I'm looking.
oh, okay.
I think it's symbolic, Liz.
Oh,
Is the
symbolic.
way I'm
Okay.
taking it.
Yeah,
It's
I can
symbolic
see that.
that
Yeah.
it's how do you I mean, I don't want I how do you unzip the sexuality of your partner or your own sexuality?
So, yeah, no, that's a good
That's
way
what
to
I
think
think.
of it. Think of it. Yeah.
So I think it's
Okay.
meant to be a vagina
Which again is
with
appropriate
a zipper.
and important.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Good symbolism there.
Okay.
Okay, so the last thing that I always like to talk about in terms of sexuality that I think is important, it's not talked about enough, is that I think it's somewhere like between 60 and 70% of women cannot achieve
That's right.
orgasm or climax without some sort of clitoral stimulation.
Yes.
So, and it is much easier for men to achieve climax than it is
Yes.
for women.
So here's one of the things I found is men don't get that.
Yeah.
And this is a cultural thing for men. They think they aren't masculine enough or manly enough if
Hmm.
their wife does not orgasm during intercourse, that's something wrong with the man.
Yeah.
Whereas they just need to talk about it. And so sometimes what I'll do, maybe even all the time, is it's education. We are
Yeah.
so uneducated about sexual response,
And
and
anatomy.
it yes, and it's crazy to me that you can get through, high school and college without this basic knowledge. And so often it's just a knowledge that says, there's a certain percentage of women who don't orgasm that way.
Hmm.
And so you have to be open to other methods, but you have to talk about it first.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I've run into a woman who feels like there's something wrong with her, but I would guess that happens. And
I'm
so
sure.
the
Yeah.
women have to be able to understand there's nothing wrong with you. You
Right.
just have to be able to talk about it. And there are many other ways for you to achieve orgasm.
Hmm.
You're
Right.
you're absolutely right. It's a good thing to bring up. But from my experience, it's the men who don't get it
Right.
and who really somehow take it personally.
Yeah. I mean, it has absolutely nothing to do with them. And it does not
No,
have to do with the
no,
size or length,
nothing.
girth, anything to do with the penis. It has
No,
everything to do with the
yeah,
structure of the woman. And
yeah,
again, it's not that there's anything wrong with her structure, it's
just
just
different.
different. So there's this gynecologist, her name is Mama Dr. Jones, and
Hmm.
she does a lot of videos on Facebook and YouTube. And a lot of it, she's reacting to something, right? She's reacting to funny TikToks or something like that regarding, menstruation or anything to do really with vaginal health, with gynecology. And she once said, "It is shocking to me how few women understand and fully know their own anatomy.
Yeah. That book, Come As You Are,
Mm-hmm.
that is, I don't know how many chapters are dealing with it, but it is the first thing we deal with.
Yeah, is just adequately labeling. And, some women don't even understand that there's like what the vagina actually is versus like the vaginal canal versus the labia. Like those are differences, and they're important differences. And, I don't know if we can call it a failure of the public education system, but or maybe what I think it is I think it's taught, but it's taught maybe once and nobody remembers it. So hopefully this is something that you're bringing up with your kids. And, I think that women should know how males develop and men should know how women develop. It's important to know both.
Yes, absolutely. And so I don't know if it's a failure of the education system. It might be, but I really think that ultimately it should be parents who are helping their kids learn this.
Yeah. And helping them to understand
it,
what your clitoris is, where it is, and what the
and
function of it is.
And so parents talking about this does not make your children be more promiscuous. It just doesn't.
No.
And you really need to give them a good knowledge base so that when they're married, they can have a more fulfilling and satisfying sexual relationship. Or when they're partnered, I don't want to just say when they're married, but when they're partnered, they can have a more fulfilling relationship.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't talk about it, they're going to just assume that there's something wrong with it, and it's going to start a shame spiral, which is very unhelpful and unfulfilling in a long-term committed relationship. And there's so many books out there, and there's so many developmentally appropriate ways to teach your kids. I mean, I think the first way that I've done it with my kids is I've just found a diagram online and said, okay, here's the different parts. This is what they are, and this is what they're called. And then another thing that I think we've talked about before, and I know that Lindy has brought up, is the importance of not getting things nicknames. Because if you give it a nickname, then that sends a signal to them that this is not okay.
I can't say the correct name for some reason, like it's forbidden or something.
Yeah, it gives a negative connotation. So the importance of being anatomically correct with your kids. And also, I mean, I don't know that this is real, but I heard the story of this girl who went up to her teacher one time and was like, my uncle licked my cookie. And the teacher goes, oh, I'm sorry. Next time, get a different cookie. And then later on down the road, the mom comes in and is talking about, oh, yeah, she had an infection in her cookie. And the teacher's all of a sudden going, what?
What? Yeah.
Wait a minute here. That's a big red flag. So, there's all sorts of good reasons. To be anatomically correct.
So parents, please don't be afraid to talk to your children about this. It's really important. And it helps. It's one of the steps that is helpful for a healthy adult sexual relationship. I really think.
Yes, it really is. And then the last thing briefly is being a sexual team. You love talking about couples need to be a team.
I try and help couples think of that. You can be a parenting team, you can be a financial team, you can be a sexual team. And what I'm trying to help couples understand is you're working at this together.
Yeah.
And so you can't just be approaching it unilaterally. You have to, each of you has the input. And it goes back to the very first thing we talked about is the dialogue.
Right.
And here's what I found. The more you talk about it, the easier it is to talk about it.
Yep.
So yes, if you haven't talked about it and you bring it up, it will be uncomfortable. That's okay. You will work through the discomfort, and the more you talk about it, the easier it will be, and the better your relationship will be, both physically and emotionally. I really believe that.
Yeah, and set the expectation that when we talk about sexuality, it is a judgment-free zone.
Yes.
And you have to mean that. So, let your partner know, you can tell me anything. I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to laugh at you. I'm not going to say, oh, that's stupid. I'm going to accept you as you are because I love you for who you are.
That's it. Exactly. Good takeaway.
Right. Okay. So we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at
mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.